Jasmine. Not if you can hear me. Yes. Oh, check. Mic check. Brooklyn is in the house.
More like Aguada right now.
Puerto Rico's in the house.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'll stand up. It's your time to shine. Okay. Hey. Hey, everyone. How's it going? Can you hear me online okay? Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Saidi. I'm a part of the education team here at the People's Forum. So if you don't know what we are, we're a space for political and cultural work. We're a space for people who are essentially people and organizations who are in struggle together for a better world. So if you're new here, nice to meet you. And if you're a returnee, welcome back. We have a bunch of really cool events coming up. We have this amazing book talk tonight. Then we have a really cool People's Fashion Show tomorrow, so come check it out for that. And we have a really crucial conference about the war in Ukraine on Saturday. So the spaces for that is filled up in person, but you can check it out online. So I'm really excited for this talk today on this really great book, Vida y Hacienda, The Life and Legacy of Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos. I was talking about Dr. Pedro with some folks and comrades today, and it just struck with me, like, this guy was a really important militant. Like, he was so dedicated, and like, one thing that stuck out to me was like, he was about the action. Like, he committed his life to the freedom of his people and just to freedom in general. So to that, I really respect it. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our wonderful authors today. So first, we have the author, Andre Lee Muñiz, who's a Boricua raised in the projects of Brooklyn, New York. After earning an MA from New York University, he worked primarily as an educator, teaching math and facilitating youth leadership development. From 2013 to 2016, he was NYC regional editor of La Respuesta magazine, an online publication by, for, and about the Boricua diaspora. He has also been published online by Gozamos and 80 Grados, and in print by La Galeria magazine, NYC. Sorry, y'all, my Spanish is rough. And in 2020, he created and launched the website rememberingdonpedro.com in order to chronicle the life and work of Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos. And all the way live from Puerto Rico, and a longtime friend of the People's Forum, whose artwork you could actually see on display in this space, in these four walls. We have Brooklyn born and raised, but Western Borican, Yasmin Hernandez. Yasmin is an artist and activist who is exhibited and presented her work in the US and Puerto Rico, and holds a BFA from Cornell University. She's worked as an educator with Taller Puertorriqueño in Philadelphia, a Museo del Barrio, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. So Vieques, Tierra de Valientes, is her tribute to activists who ended US Navy bombing practices in Vieques, the island that sparked her fascination with bioluminescence and inspired her 2014 rematriation. Reflecting on the perpetual darkness of power outages due to hurricanes Irma and Maria, climate change, and colonialism, in the fall of 2022, she launched Cucuba Nacion, a community art space in Mayagüez dedicated to liberatory lessons learned from Boricua bioluminescence. Yasmin's Rematriating Borican project explores the decolonial journey, home and aesthetics inspired by the Puerto Rico Trench. She shares her writing and art at yasminhernandezart.com and Rematriating Borican. So with that, I'm really excited for this really insightful book talk, and I'm gonna pass it over to Andre to lead us.
Thank you. Jasmine is also a mom. So thank you all for coming out tonight. We're gonna kind of go back and forth with this, right? So Jasmine and I know each other for a number of years. I think what I want to start off with, that I rarely get the opportunity to start off this way, is kind of how everything started. And Jasmine and I were kind of reflecting on this last night, actually. And you know, one thing that is very important for me to highlight is I am definitely the product of the killing of Filiberto Ojeda Rios, right? So Filiberto was a Puerto Rican revolutionary who was killed on September 23rd, 2005. And at the time, I was a 19-year-old sort of just young person doing his own thing, not caring much about anything. And my father, the next year, said, we're going to a march protest that is going from Times Square, right around here actually, to the United Nations on September 23rd, 2006, right, to celebrate and honor El Grito de Lares, which happened in 1868. That is considered the birth date of the Puerto Rican nation, and to protest the killing of Filiberto, which was, across the board recognized as a gross violation of human rights, in Puerto Rico. And my father brought me out to that protest, and at that protest, I met people, and then he passed away. The year later, I started getting involved and becoming active. One of the people that I met was Yasmin, right? And so one of the things that I definitely wanted to lead off with, and I'll keep it short and kind of see where this conversation goes. I'm gonna give it to you, Yasmin, but where I wanted to kind of lead off is this idea of legacy and intergenerational struggle, right? This is something, when we're talking about Puerto Rico and its struggle for freedom, right? Its struggle for self-determination, we're not talking about something that is happening now. We're talking about something that is happening now and has been happening, right, for many generations. I would love to keep talking more, but I'm gonna let Yasmin have some words now. Hey, Yasmin.
I turned off my video. It's a little bugged to see myself, and because I see a little delay. So I'm gonna try to not look at my video. Yes, I remember meeting you through Samuel Sanchez, a mentor, and around that time of El Grito de Lares. And I should say right now that before anything, that I'm just really happy and proud that you were able to do this. I know how important this project is for you, and honoring the legacy of your father. And perhaps I shouldn't have, spoken for that and just let you elaborate on that. But I think that reflecting on this project, this is so necessary that we're able to do this, and how happy I am to just collaborate with you again on Albizu on this whole theme. So yes, I may be in and out as I figure out I'm told that there's not a delay over there, but all right. So yes, thanks for inviting me to do this.
Excellent. So one thing that's kind of on my mind is when we're talking about Don Pedro, right? We have an event here. Yes, I'm the author of this book. But I did not write this book to become an author. I did not write this book to write a book. I wrote this book because I felt that it was necessary. Myself, I grew up as a Puerto Rican person that grew up in the projects of Brooklyn. And my parents themselves also grew up in the projects of Brooklyn, right? We're talking Brownsville. By the way, real quick, hello to everybody in virtual land, as well as in the future, who will catch this later on. Growing up in the projects of Brooklyn, all my friends, in my particular projects were African-American. I did not need to know Spanish growing up, right? So I never developed the fluency. Now, what does that mean for a Puerto Rican growing up in the diaspora, right, outside of our homeland? It means that I'm not going to have access or easy access to a lot of information about my people. So as I started learning more, there came a point in my life where when my father passed, trauma can really do something to a person, right? And it can go in so many different ways. It's not a black and white reaction to trauma, right? For me, I'm not going to say it was good or bad. I'm going to say what it was. What helped me get through my trauma of my father passing was getting into reading, right? Reading my history. So the people's history is what really helped me get through that trauma. Wepa. And as I learned more and more, you read the English books, whatever's available, they throw in some Spanish words now and then, and I looked them up, and then I started wanting more, right? So eventually I started learning from the Spanish language sources, right? Google Translate was my best friend. I would always have a dictionary open. And so I did it. And after years of compiling all this research, which I would say started in 2013, when I was working at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, shout out to El Centro, But I was working there, and they just have an amazing wealth of resources. So I hit the archives, beyond just the library, I hit the archives. And long story short, I decided to make his life and legacy available in English. There was a little bit of a, something specific to add. I say that my book is the first biography written in English, and that is true because I wrote it in English. There is a biography on him that is available in English, but it's a translation over 50 years ago from the original Spanish. And as somebody who worked for this magazine called La Respuesta, by, for, and about the Boricua diaspora, I feel very strongly about Puerto Ricans like myself who represent and were grown up in the diaspora to also, do things that, if somebody's not going to write the things that you need to be the one to write it. That's the wavelength that I was on when I wrote this book. And yeah, I'm going to stop there because I want to go back and forth. And then I feel like the next time I speak, I'll probably go more into Don Pedro. But at the end of the day, it's a book event, right? We're talking about the book and how it came to be. And that's kind of how it came to be. At the same time, there's a book out, War Against All Puerto Ricans, that came out a couple of years ago. Amazing book. I haven't read it in a couple of years, right? But I just want to bring up the fact that I wrote this book for a reason. I did not shy away from saying in the book that I do support Puerto Rico's independence, its right to independence. I did not shy away from doing that. I did not write this book to be an author and to get into spaces. I wrote this for a reason and not the season, as some might say, because I know that when people pick this up, they're going to be sparked, right? This can seriously, make an impact in people's understanding of Puerto Rico's anti-colonial struggle, because they'll be learning about the person that, perhaps, I'm not going to say most embodied that struggle, but perhaps most embodied that struggle, because when we talk about all of the tactics and strategies that he literally used all of them. We're talking about elections. They didn't work, so then they boycotted the elections. They had class struggles, right? Worker strikes, right? They had, he was a statesman. He wrote to the leaders of other countries. He obviously talked about armed struggle, right? But before he got to that point of, saying we're going to start the revolution on October 30, 1950, he had tried other means that were democratic, right? Which I'll probably talk later about the Constitutional Convention movement of 1936, which a lot of people, especially in the English language, don't know about that. But I'm just going to stop there and give Yasmin some light.
Thank you for saying that you haven't read Nelson Denis's book in a while. I think that these books about our history, they're not meant to be read once. They're meant to be, explored over and over, taking notes, examined, because there's so much. The other thing that I find is that as I go through life, as I have different experiences, I take different things from the book, from the books, I should say. And so that's how I felt, I told you last night, that's how I felt reading this book, that I was responding to different parts of Albizu's life that that perhaps I hadn't really considered 10 years ago or 20 years ago, reading Marisa Rosado's book, Las Llamas de la Aurora. So it's like the context that we have in our personal lives and our personal experiences get responded to, get activated, get expanded on by the books we read and when we read them. And then that each author adds a different layer, a different take on not just Albizu's life, but his legacy as well. So that's what I'll say to that. I want you to speak mostly though, because it's your book.
I actually have a question for you, Yasmin.
Yeah.
Just so that people can know a little bit more about the amazing work that you do. There you are sitting in front of one of your pieces on Don Pedro. And, you know, you've done, I don't know, I want to say hundreds of pieces of art throughout your life, right? Let's just talk about Don Pedro, right? You know, how many pieces on Don Pedro have you done in your life? And
this piece, this piece is from 2007. I would say that I've done like, it's hard to say. I think somewhere between a dozen and 2 dozen, I think closer to 2 dozen of Albizu, but then it's like there are paintings and then there are drawings and then there's things that I don't keep track of. And then there's what I call the remixes of taking a painting and repurposing it.
Now a book cover. And now a book cover.
The book cover as well. So yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, but this is from Archivos Subversivos, and this is about these subversive files and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you speak a little bit to the subversive files? Because I have a follow-up to that, but can you just
and you have, you know, well, you kind of mentioned it in your book, but just the whole thing with the 1950 and the revolution, the subversive files, that's what I call this project, but the idea is that they were deemed subversives. So the government, you know, the colonial government starts seeking files on them, much like COINTELPRO was doing here, you know, in organizations. I say here, I'm putting myself over there and I'm in Puerto Rico. But much like the FBI was doing in the States, right? So here in Puerto Rico, they were keeping files on these suspected subversives, as they called it. Pero this is based on just what those files, you know, the aesthetic of the files themselves and typewriters, you know, what they were using in these times, the materials they were using to just track the whereabouts of these folks, what meetings they were going to, who was in these meetings, who were they talking to, what cars, these are the kinds of things you would see. And you could see some of these files at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, what kind of cars they were driving, what was the make, the model, the color, who was in it. If there was some mobilization, they had a list of everybody who was at that mobilization there. They had names, they had relatives' names. These are the kinds of things that were going on. Can you tell us about how this comes up in your book?
Yeah. So, you know, writing the book was definitely an interesting moment in my life because there's so many amazing things that we can say about Don Pedro, right? He knew several languages, you know, he definitely knew at least 7 languages, right? Including his native Spanish. He graduated from Harvard College, right? He graduated eventually from Harvard Law School. He became a lawyer. And when he came back to Puerto Rico, he denied a bunch of jobs that could have had him set for life. And the reason why he did that was because he wanted to work for his people. In doing that, you know, he was so steadfast, he was so determined in his activism that in 1927, he volunteered with the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico to make a tour of Latin America to gain support for Puerto Rico's independence movement. And he went to Dominican Republic, he went to Cuba, he went to also, and this is kind of coming to my point, he also went to Haiti, right? And I see a bunch of art here saying hands off Haiti, because as a lot of us know, because of what's going on in Haiti and the people's, you know, rising up to determine their own lives, right, to better their conditions, and then now there's talks about, you know, a military invasion of Haiti, you know, and he went to Haiti, you know, back in 1928, and during that time, and he said the person that was driving the ship, or, you know, commandeering the ship, said, "We're not going to stop at Haiti. Like, it's crazy there. I'm not docking this boat." And he insisted. He said, "No, we're going to stop there. I don't care what risk I'll be putting myself in. I have to show that I'm willing to support a people's right to determine their own lives," right? So he did that. You know, he met the nationalist leaders there. He made some speeches. They also had a reception for him. It was a big thing. It was published in local papers and in papers in the region. And, I kind of bring up this history to say that that was the beginning of the surveillance of Don Pedro Albizu Campos by the United States government and, the allies of the United States government in other countries, right? So we're talking about, the police in Cuba. We're talking like that. That was when they started compiling the record, right? The subversive record on Don Pedro. And I kind of want to use that to bridge into talking about the year 1936, because the year 1936 is when Don Pedro was charged with seditious conspiracy, right? With attempting to overthrow the United States government in Puerto Rico, and was eventually sentenced to exile. He spent a decade outside of his homeland, right? Most of it in Atlanta Penitentiary. And the thing about the year 1936 is so interesting because whenever we hear about the year 1936, we always hear about that trial and how there was a jury that could not reach a verdict, right? So then the prosecutor hand-selected a second jury, right, composed of mostly North American residents in Puerto Rico, and then I think it was like 2 Puerto Ricans with obvious ties to North American United States companies, and then he was arrested. So everybody knows about that. But what a lot of people don't talk about is how there's so much history to this, But in April 1936, there was a senator that actually proposed a bill for independence for Puerto Rico, and it would give the island independence if everybody voted for such. But the consequences of that transition from being a territory to an independent nation would essentially leave Puerto Rico in ruin. The people would be in starvation. But what this bill did was it created this amazing discussion on the island about independence, right? People obviously had heard Don Pedro for years talking about it, right? So we're talking about since 1924 when he came back from Harvard. But when this talk started happening in 1936, there were people that supported statehood at the time that said, well, if they're going to give us the opportunity to vote for our independence, we should do that, even if it means we're going to be hungry. There were people that said it's better to be free and hungry than to be full stomach, but not having your freedom, right? And this is coming from the statehood leaders at the time and the other political leaders. So what did Don Pedro do? He said, we should immediately hold a constitutional convention, declare ourselves independent, right? Elect representatives that would then negotiate with the United States our treaty terms, right? As he's on trial for seditious conspiracy. And, I know I'm sharing a lot, but the reason why I bring it up is because, the military records, show or document the Colonel Cole, who was stationed in Puerto Rico at the time, a colonel in the United States Army, saying that the climate in Puerto Rico at the time is giving Don Pedro a very good chance of becoming the president of an independent Puerto Rico. And knowing that this movement is happening, which, by the way, after the first call for a constitutional convention was made, 2.5 weeks later, more than 30 municipalities had come up in favor of that movement. We're talking a time period where almost every day newspapers were showing on the front page or inside the newspaper pictures of the Puerto Rican flag being raised up in high schools, in universities, in the town halls, right? In one case, I think it was May 12th, I was just looking at the book, May 12th, 1936, at the Central High School in, I think it was Santurce, right? The students were actually, the police came and shot in the air to get the students to disperse, right? The police eventually went away, but the students came back. They said there was rioting, and then the National Guard was called up, right? So we're talking about something that is having a very serious impact. People are joining this movement for a constitutional convention to declare Puerto Rico independent. Even the military officials are saying this movement is concerning. Don Pedro can become the president of Puerto Rico. And it just goes to show you how, in the documentation, in these subversive files, there's so much to say about how the movement was attacked, and because it was a concern for the powers that be.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I have my video off just because of my signal to make sure I don't, because I already left for a few seconds, but I want to go back to what you asked about, or what you mentioned with the subversive files, because when you mentioned it, I was immediately thinking, not to jump ahead in the chronology, but I was already thinking about like the gag law in 1948. And I actually didn't realize until you said it right now that Albizu's tour and going to Haiti and going to Latin America is when they actually started the surveillance process. So are we talking about like the late 1920s that they had already started keeping surveillance on Albizu Campos?
Yes.
Because in the States, we know this, or we really know this with like the civil rights movement, which I know I had started before, but like people know this experience from how they attacked communities and organizations like the Black Panthers and what have you, AIM, the Young Lords. Pero this is something that was happening with Don Pedro already from the 1920s, and that's really important to state. I think it's also important to stay talking about him being, viewed as a potential president, is the reach that he had, not just throughout Latin America, but specifically with a country like Haiti, which I think has been deemed dangerous by the oppressive systems across the world, and especially in this hemisphere from jump. And that's something that we touched upon last night, was also very important to Betances, who came before Albizu in the 1868 revolution, so many times they separate us, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean from the rest of the Caribbean, but that here we have these two pro-independence revolutionaries that always made it a point to connect us to other countries, especially Haiti. And so I just wanted to clarify that and say thank you for bringing that forth with your book, that it, not just in 1936, but they knew it a decade earlier. The other thing that I want to state with the Tidings Bill is that a lot of people don't realize that, it's usually talked about in Puerto Rican history as a bill that would have injured Puerto Rico, or it was like Independencia la Cañona, and would have left Puerto Rico destroyed, according to Luis Muñoz Marin and other politicians who then went on to create, the Estado Libre Asociado. But that the Miller Tidings Bill, that we should know, just to contextualize this internationally, did go on in another way to grant the Philippines its independence. So I'm not exactly sure of the provision, like the stipulations and how Puerto Rico and the Philippines factored in, but my understanding is that the Tidings Bill was actually responsible in some part for the Philippine independence happening, even though Puerto Rico didn't receive its independence then.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that point. That is definitely very true. One thing I just want to add about the surveillance aspect is when he was on that tour in Latin America from 1927 to 1930, what really was the turning point was he attended a conference for the world press in Cuba. And at this conference, he actually spoke and said that all of the Latin press should be explicitly having space in their publications to denounce U.S. invasions in Nicaragua, U.S. invasions in Dominican Republic, and in the region. And when that happened, they actually had to stop the conference, because, who happened to be there, right? People that were there as representatives of the United States. And so the organizers were pressured to stop the conference. It was resumed, but not until they decided to do breakout groups instead of having everybody all together. And so what is basically happening is that's another point where who is this person that is calling on the Latin press to speak out against U.S. imperialism, right? So we're talking 27, 28, 29. Yes.
I think that, it's really unfortunate how Puerto Rico's independence struggle has been, it's been like this romantic abstract concept because it's sort of been lingering for so long. Many don't know much about it. It hasn't secured its goals, so that it's just this lingering thing that people get to dismiss and relegate to art and song and stuff like that. So it becomes important to speak about Albizu and what he did because it concretizes this work. It was something that actually existed, and I think that it existed in the US's worst nightmare, right? This is a person who was educated in one of its top institutions, and even though he had that, the way that these institutions usually work is that they successfully conform people. That's really what I believe these institutions are. And in the case of Albizu, it didn't work that way. It was, I now know how your leaders work and think. I now know how your military works and thinks. And I can use all of this for the purpose of my own nation's liberation struggle. And so it was like he knew too much. He knew too much about the US. He knew too much in general. I believed him to be a genius. He spoke, I don't know if it was 7 or 8 languages. And so the level of just intellect and strategy and vision and spirit and intelligence and the reach that went outside of Puerto Rico, I think was just so completely terrifying to the United States powers that be that, one of the things that you stipulate, that you point out in your book, is all the ways that they tried to literally break him and literally eradicate him without straight up killing him, right? It's pointed out various times. You can't kill him because we don't need a martyr. And I don't know if I'm jumping the gun and getting to this point, but it was like, this starts with that arrest. To go back to what you were talking about, the Constitutional Convention happening at the time of the arrest, 1937, he's in Atlanta, and these things have already begun where we see his health fail because of the treatment that he saw in prison. Something's still happening in the United States with prisoners today, with Mumia Abu-Jamal, with, what have you, where we're seeing people being pardoned like Albizu was because they're virtually on their deathbed, or not being pardoned at all, or being pardoned and then dying when they leave. Like this continued practice of US imperialism to just want to erase the people who can hold the keys to true liberation.
Yeah, I mean, even the hip hop community, is aware that Tupac's godfather, right, Mutulu Shakur, has been released only because he's essentially, terminally ill, right? After, 1980s, we're talking about being 40 years, forgive me, those in virtual land for not knowing the dates, but longer than he should have, been there, so it's a very interesting thing. We talk about the gag law. One of the things that I think should be mentioned is we're talking about a law that prevented people from assembling peacefully. All right, we're talking about a law that violated people's rights to freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But I bring that up to say that there are also these, aspects of the gag law that a lot of people may not be aware of, that you and I were talking about last night. Something as simple as giving donations to the family, who lost a family member who happened to be a nationalist that was killed, by the colonial government, because they thought that they would be arrested for giving donations to the family, right? So relief aid, putting the flowers on the graves of the victims of the Ponce massacre of 1937 was something that people were arrested for, right? We're talking about a law that arrested people for attending meetings, right? Again, freedom of assembly, right? But just to show you, it wasn't something as easy as you cannot speak there on that street corner. It was something as insidious as, no, you cannot give flowers to honor the dead, right? No, you cannot give this family who just lost their main breadwinner money, and that's one thing that we were speaking about that I think was important to mention, the gag law of 1950, which was later found, right, after all of these nationalist leaders were in prison for many years, found to be unconstitutional, right, and then repealed. So
it's like a spiritual warfare to think about the way that, perhaps it was a counter, strategy to Albizu, because Albizu's vision covered, as I mentioned, so many grounds, right? He tried to speak to the people's faith and even brought in religion. Like, he was going everywhere. He had like all grounds covered in how he can speak to people and the psyche, the Puerto Rican psyche, if you will. But I think that with this law, it was like, how do they destroy it from every angle possible? So even the outlawing of the flag, right? That there was no national symbol, and that the Nationalist Party were the folks that would display this flag without the US flag right next to it, which technically is still a law to this day, that if you have any official buildings and you hang you fly the Puerto Rican flag, the US flag must fly next to it at all times, right? So something that is very interesting to me to consider, that level, that personal level. You can't raise funds for families. You can't give flowers or mourn grieve the dead if they died in this way, if they were pro independence activists or whatever. And the fact that I say was spiritual warfare is how it has been passed on for generations. So that me being here today, I lived for 6 years in Moca, which is a community that is known for being very Christian, and also not a community, it's a municipality, and also very pro-statehood. And I lived there for 3 years before I started to see Puerto Rican flags, and the resurgence of Puerto Rican flags flying came as a result of Hurricane Maria. So it took for this disaster for people to feel a connection enough to say, we're gonna fly this flag. It's not to say there were no flags, but like my neighbor across the street, who was a statehooder and a vet, would fly his flag on Veterans Day, on Memorial Day, would take out a big dookie American flag and wave it. And you did see a good amount of American flags. What you didn't see enough of were Boricua flags. I knew of 2 places where, besides our house, where Puerto Rican flags flew alone. And then you started to see that change after Maria. So just considering, I also told you yesterday, like, these aren't conversations that are had about like Albizu. We do have things named after him, but you're not going to hear him still in school lessons, right? I think I've seen one paragraph and one photo of him in one of my children's school books. and it's not elaborated on. It's still covered. There's still a gag law on the psyche, right? Generations later. 1948 was when the law was passed. Is that correct? So in 1948, my mom was born in 1949, right? So I would be like, what, second generation gag law? I'm being raised by somebody who was born into this law, and where you weren't allowed to talk about these things, and you still are not in 2022.
Wow, it's so true. So one thing I'm gonna say is I'm gonna plug the book a little bit because I think that it's very important for people to learn about Puerto Rico, to learn about who Don Pedro was. And I just wanted to say to everybody that's listening is I definitely wrote this book for a general audience. This can be used in high schools, junior high schools. You won't find the big academic language in this book. Sorry, not sorry. The point was really to simple, what was his life, what was his legacy? And I bring that up to say that when I was thinking about how to sort of end the book, how to tie it to the contemporary time, one of the things that came to me was this story that I read in the oral history of Ruth Reynolds at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, right? Ruth Reynolds being a white North American anti-imperialist that befriended Don Pedro and was a very close friend of his when he was in the hospital in New York City, here in New York. And so what I'm going to say now is sort of, because I know we're going to be closing up soon, but it's more of a hopeful message that I have, because the story that Ruth Reynolds shared, that Don Pedro shared with her, was a story that he had from his childhood. Right. So remember, Don Pedro was born biologically, right, in 1893, because he's known to have two birth dates, one in 1891 and one in 1893. He had a brother that was born in 1891. His mother was a spiritualist. So when that child died, not long after it was born, Don Pedro was born in 1893 on El Dia de San Pedro. And so she believed it was the soul of the firstborn child reincarnated in his body. So she actually did not register his birth in the Catholic Church and all of that. Anyway, yet I digress. So he was born in 1893. The United States took over in 1898. Right after that, there was an incredibly intense hurricane known as San Ciriaco. And Don Pedro told Ruth Reynolds that he remembers being a boy, right? So we're talking about San Ciriaco. This is on par with Hurricane Maria as far as its impact on Puerto Rico, souls lost and damage to property and et cetera, et cetera. Don Pedro shared that he remembered being a boy, a young boy, and he saw a uniformed officer from the military, the United States Army. And he overheard, and this is Don Pedro as a 8-year-old, right? Or excuse me, a 5-year-old, 6-year-old. He remembers hearing that officer tell somebody, wow, this hurricane was a godsend because the United States wouldn't have been able to gain control as easily and as quickly without it. Right? So now fast forwarding to Hurricane Maria and the collapse of the power grid, the damage to people's, farmlands, to people's homes, the loss of life, right? But, the difference now is now you're seeing that black flag, right? Now you're seeing people understand that, not only understand, but understand after seeing very clearly that, you know what, the best people to bring us out of this situation is going to be ourselves, because that's kind of what we're doing, right? And then now after the most recent hurricane, same thing, right? So I just wanted to add that. I don't know if you want to add to that, Jasmine, but, in thinking about that, 1898, San Ciriaco, 1899, but then Hurricane Maria, and now the people are starting to have this spirit of self-determination in a sense. It's for me, it's been incredible to see it. And when I say incredible, I don't mean like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing ever, but it's inspiring. It's inspiring to see people organize and come together, yes, out of a serious need, but then people having that switch in their minds of, I wonder what else is possible.
I think that people have gotten tired of the cycles repeating, and recognize that the United States is not the savior, as has always been the idea. On top of 1899 and San Ciriaco, right after the invasion, there was also San Felipe right before I think it was 1928. I don't have the exact date in my mind, but San Felipe, I think, was also these three hurricanes, Maria, Felipe, Ciriaco, I think are all around category 4s and 5s. And so it's to go back to the 1930s and consider that was the decade that the Nationalist Party was going toe to toe with the United States, but it's coming on the tail end of the destruction of San Felipe and the Depression. And so it also makes sense that Luis Muñoz Marin would have his rise there, like come in and step into this void of these nationalists who were sent to Atlanta, and left that void of leadership sort of in Puerto Rico. And then that's when Luis Muñoz Marin capitalizes on the poverty and the struggle to say, well, let's bring in the US because the US is gonna deliver, so we're gonna be okay if we hang out with them. And then now, fast forward to Maria, it's same shit, different day, and so, the question of people coming together in more self-sufficient ways and recognizing that there's not going to be this entity that brings this deliverance, that deliverance has to come from ourselves. I think that there still needs to be, what I see actually is people responding to what's happening right now, but that there still sort of lacks a general historical context, because that has been omitted from the education, and because that repression continues, so that it's really difficult. Like, you had Albizu so organized with these chapters throughout the archipelago, hitting up the sugar strikers and the striking workers and different places and spaces, so that education was happening in the streets in a popular way. The way that it's happening today is around the notion of let's take care of each other, but I'm not sure how much it's going so deeply collectively. There are groups doing this, but what is the organized structure throughout the archipelago that is saying part of this is, a great part of this is not just climate change, but colonialism, and the two have to be combated. Just today, someone told me, that the status is not the question. You now have people running for office with omitting status from their platforms. And so if you omit status from your platform, then you're not choosing to address the colonial question. And so there is a weird thing of people helping themselves and helping each other, but still not wanting to talk about the political destruction that is imperialism. And so that's the part that I think has to be tweaked more and developed more. And in closing, can I bring you to the way you end the book, which is, there were these two words that I had to just share that were so important to kind of leave any dialogue on Albizu with, which is, you included a quote in the end describing Albizu as the conscious, right, of Puerto Rico. And so the question right now is, where lies the conscious of Puerto Rico? And the other word that was used, but I believe Yvonne Acosta, was transmutación, or the transmutation, this idea of shift and change and expansion and transcendence. that we have to like go beyond the confines of colonialism to find a solution beyond that, right? And so that the loss of Albizu, the loss of Filiberto, the loss of these incredible leaders has left this vacuum in this concept of what is conscious, what is our conscious as a people, as a collective.
Yes, thank you. So I think maybe we should give our closing remarks. I'll let you go. I'll let you have the final word. So last thing I just wanted to say is, right, when we're talking about that constitutional convention idea, you know, that's something that has continued, right, through history in Puerto Rico. People have, you know, Don Pedro was not the last to attempt to have a constitutional convention. Most recently, you had the Puerto Rico Status Act, you know, and other bills that were put into Congress by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and, you know, and others, right? Where they met and discussed, you know, what this bill would look like, you know, and having independence, you know, in the options, right? Sometimes people ask me, oh, what would Don Pedro say about the way things are going on with that idea of a constitutional convention? Well, he was very clear, because when he was proposing the constitutional convention, at the same time, some of his contemporaries in the political scene were actually going to Washington, D.C. and having closed doors meetings with people in Congress, you know, in D.C., you know, in the Senate, to talk about, you know, negotiations and the possibility of becoming independent. And what did Don Pedro say? Is that they want to end where they should start, right? But we should really start where they propose to end. So basically, it's to say that he was all about, we're going to declare our independence first, our self-determination, and then any negotiations will come after, right? And the last thing I just wanted to say is, yes, we're talking about a historical figure, right? But he is still relevant today. We're talking about somebody that, if it wasn't for him, you know, we wouldn't have this national anthem called La Borinqueña, because it was written during the Grito de Lares times of 1868. But it wasn't until Don Pedro said, we're going to resurrect that, or, you know, bring that back, right? Uphold that as our national anthem against the United States invasion, right? And so I bring up La Borinqueña specifically because, hey, we have like the first Puerto Rican superhero, La Borinqueña, right? So without Don Pedro, you know, I wonder what La Borinqueña would be called today, right? But so many other things. We're talking about the pride of the flag, right? Going through that gag law era, and Don Pedro saying, this is our national symbol. You know, Puerto Ricans are still so proud of it to this day. Every September 23rd, right? People still make the pilgrimage to Lares, Puerto Rico, to commemorate and honor El Grito de Lares. He started that, right? So this is, yes, a historical figure who has relevance today. His impact still exists today, lasts to today. There's schools named after him. There's children named after him, which it was amazing to see people reaching out to me saying, wow, thank you. My son is named after Albizu. And there are spaces in Puerto Rico, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia named after him. So this is a person that is relevant today. And most importantly, because Puerto Rico still remains to be free. Yasmin, final words.
I'm trying to, my signal is a little weak, so I hope this comes through. Okay, I'm like seeing I'm not even looking because I see, do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm trying to come up with final words that are not going to be too heavy, because I think for final words, I never talk about this, but I want to say that I'm an Albizuista, and I want to say that I don't participate in the electoral process to this day. There's a lot of things that are unpopular today, and I I take pride in taking positions that are unpopular. And I especially take pride knowing that I'm following in the footsteps of things that were proclaimed by Albizu. Today, my position is different than it was when I was in my 20s, which was, we'll get independent and figure it out later. I still want independence, but what I understand is that independence and sovereignty and liberation is something that we must work personally, because there's a lot of toxicity and there's a lot of ways in which we perpetuate the oppression of imperialism in our own bodies and with our own people. And so my admiration of Albizu is not just that he was so radical in his approach, but his commitment to his own personal spirit and his commitment to his own people. The politicians of today are failing Puerto Rico because they are prioritizing corporate wealth versus the collective well-being of its own people. And Albizu always was committed to the well-being of the collective and to his own well-being, to the point of sacrifice. I come back to that concept of the conscious of Puerto Rico and a conscious of a people, because the conscious of Puerto Rico, some people don't like the term nationalism, but the fact that he had all these alliances that he developed with India, with the Indian liberation struggle, with the Irish liberation struggle, with the Haitian people, the fact that, as you point out towards the end of your book, speaking of Doña Laura, his partner, who was an indigenous Peruana, there's so many struggles that were weaved into this. The fact that he was the grandson of an enslaved woman. There's so many levels in which Albizu was a humanist, an internationalist, a liberationist. And those are the parts that I think we need to salvage today.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think at this point, I know at this point, we will be making space for questions, if there are any. I don't know if there's any virtually, but maybe we can get to that after the lovely audience that has graced us with our presence.
Hello.
Physically.
Oh, my name is Leo. Thank you so much. It was such an amazing presentation, and I'm originally from Ecuador. We don't really hear about Puerto Rico, but we know there's like this fight for independence, and it's like wonderful to have something that we can like really get an understanding. And my question is, how was Dr. Albizu influenced by the Soviet Revolution, or like if he had like any talks with Sandino or Mariátegui, because it feels like he was such an internationalist that he was like involved with so many people around it. And I just wanted to like see like how was the geopolitical concept of that time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So I think my response to that question is the Soviet aspect. You know, I don't know if there is much written on his knowledge and awareness of the Soviet Revolution. What I can speak to is Augusto Sandino. Sandino was somebody, you know, in Nicaragua who was essentially the people's leader. This is a person that was very much anti-imperialist, right? And I think, you know, perhaps there's more on Albizu with the Indian struggle, the Irish struggle, the struggle in Nicaragua, because they were specifically or explicitly anti-imperialist, right? They were more about, you know, national independence, right? But the Sandino one is actually very interesting. Thank you for bringing that up, because when Augusto Sandino was, you know, active, the Nationalist Party actually had a publication where they wrote often about what was happening in Nicaragua. So their publication, it was originally called El Nacionalista de Ponce, which that was in the 1920s. And then when he came back from his pilgrimage in 1930, he said, El Nacionalista de Ponce is too narrow. It became El Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, right? It became to have a national perspective. And that paper would regularly publish what was happening in Nicaragua and in other countries. But I really want to touch on the Sandino part because, as we all know, he was assassinated, right, with the involvement of the United States. And the Nationalist Party saw what happened. And they very much feared that something similar would happen to Don Pedro. And I was actually thinking about this when you were speaking, Yasmin, about the attacks on this man, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, because as I was writing this book and as I'm continuing to reflect more on the research, I truly believe that he would have been killed the same way Augusto Sandino was killed. Because in the 1930s, before he was imprisoned and sent to exile, there were several attempts on his life at his home, usually at night, with drive-by shootings, people going by to firebomb his home. But the only reason why he survived them is because his the people in the Nationalist Party, I want to say his followers, but yes, they were his followers, but they were also very committed, of their own spirit to the independence struggle, right? So they were also leaders themselves. They had an armed guard around Don Pedro 24/7. I think it was starting in 1935. And whenever these attempts would happen, they were very close to succeeding. But because there was an armed guard around Don Pedro, they were able to keep him alive each time. Why? Because specifically they saw what happened to Sandino, and they feared the same thing would happen to Don Pedro. So I think that answers part of your question. Definitely, Albizu was an internationalist, as Yasmin was talking about. Augusto Sandino is somebody that was very dear. I do not know if they're, right, so to answer more, I don't know about their personal correspondence. I don't have that answer. I could probably look into that. But I would not be surprised if they did have some kind of personal correspondence. But then again, if you're fighting if you're engaging in a revolution, you might not have time to get to everybody. But yes. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Yasmin. Sorry.
This is more of a thank you so much for writing this book. I'm particularly happy that it spoke to you to write it to audiences, whether it be middle school and high school. As someone that is predominantly Nuyorican, grew up in a Nuyorican community, this was not taught. This was not taught to me in college. It was only because I have a very intellectual partner who said, you need to know more beyond the Nuyo of your Nuyorican roots. And so the fact that I can now give this book to my daughters to read, that they don't have to wait till adulthood, really means the world. So thank you for writing it. And I'd love for you to share where people can buy your book. I know the People's Forum is one place, school libraries. Where can we buy your book?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Definitely, People's Forum is going to have copies as of tonight. Yeah, and so the book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the usual places. I'm working not as fast as I would like to be able to sell it myself because, a lot of these places, they take a cut. And, I definitely have in my mind, projects that I would like to pursue. Thankfully for me, this one was pretty affordable out of pocket. But my next project idea is, here we have a book on Don Pedro, a biography in English, right? But how awesome would it be if we could get his own words translated into English, right? I could probably do that, but I'm going to hire a translator, right? Somebody that actually lives in Puerto Rico, and they have a translating background, and make that available. So working on doing it myself, but yeah, Amazon for now. And there might be some bookstores that are picking it up. I can't remember. I know El Maestro Boxing Gym had copies in the Bronx. Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing, because I'm so sorry, but Ecuador, right? Simón Bolívar. I also want to say that Don Pedro Albizu Campos was a very strong believer in the dream of Simón Bolívar to liberate all of the Americas. And he very much said that, you know, his dream would not be fulfilled until Puerto Rico is free. And so just wanted to add that too.
So we have one question from online. D. Gonzalez said that they would like to go back to Yasmin's question of what Andre thinks the consciousness of Puerto Rico is today.
Deep question. What is the consciousness of Puerto Rico today? There's going to be people that are going to say, this guy lives in the Bronx. What right does he have to speak about the consciousness of Puerto Rico? Yet I am Puerto Rican. I would say that my understanding of what it means to be Puerto Rican for me, and this may be very much a diaspora response, is for me to be Puerto Rican, you know, dang, I'm gonna have to say it. Shout out to Mariposa. it's Mariposa Hernandez, the poet. You know, being Puerto Rican is a state of mind, a state of soul, a state of heart. And as what she said, as far as she's concerned, the only state it's ever going to be. For me, I read a quote that Don Pedro actually said, if it wasn't for Puerto Rico's colonial situation, he would have been an artist, right? But because it's not an independent nation, he became a freedom fighter. And so I think when I heard that, you know, I was very much like, oh yeah, you know, I'm a human being. Everyone's a human being. And, you know, we try to live up to this idea that, you know, these social constructs are fake. They're false. What do they serve, right? These borders, right? What do they serve? Who are they serving? And I was very much in that space. But then I said to myself, Puerto Rico's not free. Can I say damn it? I'm going to say damn it. Damn it. And, you know, I said, you know, it's very important for me to say, yo soy Boricua. I am Puerto Rican. I am Boricua. Because there's this power, this iCloud in the world that doesn't want me to say that. You know, that would much rather I said, you know, whatever happens in Puerto Rico happens in Puerto Rico. I don't care. You know, I'm American. You know, shout out to the family of Tato Laviera. I'm a Rican. Jasmine, I don't know. I feel like maybe you should chime in on that. The consciousness of Puerto Rico. What is it?
I think that's a whole other event, that conversation. It's hard for me right now to answer that, because it's this coming weekend is what they call the so-called discovery, ¿verdad? Que enough people call it Día de la Puertorriqueñidad, except that I live in Aguada, and Aguada has a bridge that goes over to the carretera principal, and the municipality just had it redone to say Ciudad del Descubrimiento, because Aguada prides itself in claiming that this is the site that Christopher Columbus arrived to. And so this weekend, Aguada has like the biggest party and parade in commemoration of Columbus. What I understand as a rematriator is that there are those of us being called here, and some of us don't even know how and why. We arrive bewildered, but there is a call, and there is a deeper pulse, and there is a deeper spirit, and there is a deeper question. Just like the Back to Africa movement, you don't have to physically move to repatriate or rematriate. It's a process that we do in our own selves. Andre had shared this incredible quote with me by Albizu, which I don't have the quote right now, but it was something to the effect of people in Puerto Rico have to repatriate, right? That there are enough people in Puerto Rico that have traveled so far in their minds from the essence of what it is to be Boricua, that rematriation is not just an invitation to people in the diaspora to come back. It's an invitation for people right here in the archipelago to reconnect to that essence. And somehow I think that what we're seeing with the hurricanes, with the sismos, with all the seismic activity, we had a sismo this morning. We're literally being shaken back. We're being shaken from the dream, shaken from the American nightmare to be awakened to what that consciousness is and that collective conscious is, for us to decide that for our own selves and then claim a collective version of it.
Yes. One thing I just want to add, to put another thought on that question is I'm actually remembering that there's a quote by Filiberto Ojeda Rios that I love, which he said that Puerto Rico has a double history, one of them which belongs to the colonial forces, and one of them that belongs to the people in their struggle for freedom, right? And for me, as I learned about my identity as a Puerto Rican, for me, Puerto Rican culture is very much a culture of resistance, right? And there's definitely a spirit of resistance that the Puerto Rican people have had ever since the Taino greeted Columbus. Next question. Or Jasmine.
Quickly, because I would like to give time to any other questions, but what you mentioned, I didn't know that about Albizu having said that he would be an artist, and that got me all in my feelings right now. But I do want to say that, as was told to me by Filiberto's compañera, Beatriz, that he believed and he shared that he didn't believe himself as a clandestine combatant to hold a more esteemed role than any poet, teacher, artist, that Filiberto Ojeda Rios believed that every single person played a crucial part in the struggle. And I think that that's important for us to remember, because sometimes we police our own selves, like we're not doing enough. And what we need to understand is what our own talents and what our own conscious is, and just commit to do that in the most liberated way. And eso es lo que construye la nación. That's what builds the free nation.
Yes, what is that? I think Betances, Ramon Emeterio Betances said that the Puerto Rican nation belongs to those who affirm it, something like that. So it's the idea of, also that idea of, to want to be free is to begin to be free. And again, it goes so much to spirit. It goes so much to, when we're talking about independence, we're talking about revolution, you cannot talk about that without also talking about the social change, the personal change, right? The change in your character, the change in your spirit, right? Yeah. Is there another question?
Yes. So we have a comment from Hiram. Shout out Hiram. He says, Puerto Ricans are dealing with 500 years of colonization, never having been free in its history, navigating the miseducation and repression of 125 years of U.S. repression. Consciousness is distorted. And then we have another question. Considering that some U.S. legislators believe that Taiwan, a territory of China, has a right to have relationships with other nations/states, does Puerto Rico?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So considering that some U.S. legislators believe that Taiwan, a territory of China, has the right to have relationships with other nations/states, does Puerto Rico have that same right?
Puerto Rico does not have that right to have, we can't even get our darn food from the supermarket without it coming through a U.S. port via a U.S. ship. So that in all my years living in New York, I got plátanos cheaper in New York than I can buy them here in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is not allowed to have those, whether it's market trade, whether it's, Puerto Rico is a non-entity outside of Miss America and the Olympics, that is so, yet again, the United States shows its hypocrisy in foreign policy has a certain view towards its own foreign policy, and then a completely different view to its own dealings with all of its territories and colonies. But, you know, I think those are the very basic things that we could talk about its relationship to states, but when there's so little that is known about the day-to-day life in Puerto Rico, like access to food. So that I commit to growing, you know, I have plátanos in my kitchen right now because they're from my patio. And that again is also a turn to self-sufficiency. Yeah.
I was gonna be a wise ASS and say that yeah, sure, Puerto Rico can get stuff from Dominican Republic. They can get stuff from other countries as long as it's put onto US containers and ships before it goes into Puerto Rico, right? So it's like no, like yes, but no. You know, but what I wanted to say was when I was working with that magazine that I mentioned before, that was mentioned by Sadie, La Respuesta, somebody wrote an article for that publication that highlighted a group of scientists from Puerto Rico going to the Dominican Republic to look at these new rice seeds that were specially developed for a tropical environment. And, you know, the idea being of bringing that to Puerto Rico, seeing how it would take to the land in order to create more food sovereignty, more, you know, self-sustenance with regard to food. That rice grain was not allowed to enter Puerto Rico by US Customs, right? So speaking a little bit more to that, you know, talking about, you know, more specifically, the complete disallowance or, you know, opposition that has been placed in Puerto Rico around its sovereignty. Yeah. And that I think that those are all very important things, right? The Jones Act, right? People should look up the Jones Act of 1917 and how Puerto Rico cannot bring anything into its ports unless it's from a US shipping container, right? Okay, so I'm noticing the time. Jasmine, we have 4 minutes to tell the people more wonderful things. What I just want to say is that I thank everybody for tuning in. I wrote in this book, in the afterword, that I'm pretty sure a lot of people that picked this book up already believe in independence or are on the fence and will believe in independence when they get to the end of it, right? Because he was just, Don Pedro Albizu Campos was so clear in his understanding, right? The last thing I'll say is he was very clear, you know, having that legal perspective as a Harvard-educated lawyer, right, at a time when international law, by the way, was becoming a thing in the universities, right? He was very clear that in 1897, Spain granted Puerto Rico autonomy, and there was an autonomous government set up in Puerto Rico. And when the United States invaded in 1898, first of all, it was very clearly a military invasion. When they took over, that autonomous government was never consulted. Nobody from Puerto Rico was consulted when the Treaty of Paris was signed that ended the Spanish-American War in 1898, right? So Don Pedro was very clear that because nobody from the autonomous Puerto Rican government was consulted in that treaty, according to international law, is null and void. That what we are seeing today, essentially, into the current time, right, into literally today, it's 7:58 Eastern Standard Time, Puerto Rico is under an illegal occupation, right? The results of an illegal occupation that is in contrary to established international law then and now. Jasmine,
Um, I just think it's so important to recover the legacies of our ancestors, the ancestors that worked towards this, that worked towards us recovering our essence and maintaining our essence and growing that essence. And we can't continue to abandon our own stories to take on the colonizer stories or continue to abandon our own work to work for the colonizer. I think that just the importance of recovering these stories and our connections to one another, our connections to these ancestors like Albizu Campos, and tell their stories, man. When those of us get access and opportunities to write books or to write plays and to write musicals and to make music and to do whatever, let it be the people that have been invisibilized. Let it be that we use that work to visibilize these stories, these narratives that no one knows, because it really, that disconnect results in so many other ills that, I just want to commend Andre for taking this on, and anybody who takes on the sister that shared about getting this book and sharing it with her child or children, I don't remember. Thank you for being there tonight, and thank you for your commitment to teaching this to your children. Thanks for recognizing that we don't learn and we're not taught much about ourselves, but we can flip that by taking the initiative to learn about our own selves and teach others. And so that's, I think, that needs to be the priority. So thank you for everyone who tuned in, have been here, just participated today.
Shout out to Iram. Shout out to Brandon, who also did the cover design of the book. Shout out to Jasmine. I don't know, I'm from Brooklyn, so I do shout outs.
And a shout out to you. Let's give a round of applause to Andre and Yasmin for tuning in with us today. Huge round of applause to you all and our lovely people online. Thank you so much for coming out. Don't forget, you could get the book at rememberingdonpedro.com, as well as 1804 books at the People's Forum. Thank you all so much for coming out, and come out to more stuff. I'll see you around.